The polish was the wrong color. It was a subtle thing, a shade of mahogany too warm for the cool, gray grain of the Brazilian wood floors that span the penthouse. Lena noticed at the moment she knelt, the familiar scent of wax and lemon oil filling her senses. The previous maid, a woman whose tenure had lasted a mere 3 weeks, had used a cheap, reddish polish. It left a sticky, almost imperceptible residue that clung to the bottoms of her soft-soled shoes. For 3 days, Lena had worked on her hands and knees, stripping the improper wax with a special solvent that smelled of bitter almonds, her movements methodical and patient. She worked until the wood breathed again, its natural, silvery undertones returning under the vast, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering sprawl of Seoul.
Herr Employer, Kwon Min-yoon, never commented.
He moved through the cavernous apartment like a ghost in a tailored suit, a specter of silent authority. He did not speak to the staff unless a command was necessary, and his commands were always delivered in a low, even tone that carried more weight than a shout ever could. He was a man made of sharp angles and expensive fabrics, Tom Ford suits that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, a Patek Philippe watch that glinted at his wrist, shoes that never made a sound on the marble of the foyer. His presence was a pressure drop in the atmosphere, a sudden stillness that made the air feel heavy and thick. Lena had learned the rhythm of his silence. She knew the sound of the ice cubes settling in his evening glass of whiskey, the soft click of his pen against his desk in the study, the whisper of silk as he removed his tie. She cleaned around him, a ghost in her own right, her movements economical and quiet.
She was good at her job.
She was invisible. It was, she thought, the only way to survive in a place like this, a place where the silence hummed with unspoken violence and every shadow seemed to hold its breath. But lately, the silence had begun to feel different. It felt watchful. When she dusted the obsidian monolith of his desk, she could feel his eyes on her back, a physical weight. His gaze was not lewd or dismissive. It was analytical, like a predator studying unfamiliar prey that had wandered into its territory. He would be sitting in his leather chair, a tablet in his hand, yet she knew his attention was entirely on her, on the deliberate sweep of her cloth, on the slight curve of her spine as she worked. He noticed things. He noticed the way she organized the books on his shelves not by color, as the decorator had, but by subject and then author, a small act of rebellion he never mentioned but had not corrected. He noticed that her bag, a simple canvas tote, was always heavier when she left at night than when she arrived in the morning. Tonight, the feeling was acute. As she gathered her things, her shift over, the pressure of his observation was a tangible force at the base of her neck. She pulled on her worn coat, the comforting weight of it a familiar shield. In her tote bag, tucked beneath her wallet and a paperback novel, were 3 foil-wrapped containers of leftover beef bulgogi, rice, and kimchi from the kitchen. The head cook, Mrs. On, always packed them for her, a silent conspiracy between the two women. "You are leaving, Lena," he stated. It was not a question. His voice was a low rumble from across the vast living room. He stood by the window, a silhouette against the city lights, the whiskey glass in his hand catching the distant neon. "Yes, Mr. Kwon. My shift is over." Her own voice was steady, betraying none of the tension that coiled in her stomach. He turned his head slightly, and even in the dim light, she could feel the intensity of his stare. "You work diligently. You are thorough. But you are quiet." She did not know how to respond to that. It felt like an accusation. "I try not to be a disturbance, sir." A long silence stretched between them, taut and humming. He took a slow sip of his drink. "See that you continue not to be," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, sharp as glass. He turned back to the window, a clear dismissal. Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and slipped out of the penthouse, the heavy door clicking shut behind her with an air of finality. She knew he was still watching her, even through the solid wood. In his world, a world of loyalty and betrayal written in blood, a quiet maid with a heavy bag was a loose thread. And Kwon Min-joon always pulled on the loose threads until he found out what they were attached to. He could not abide a mystery in his own home. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that her invisibility was about to end. Kwon Min-jun did not trust things that did not make sense. His empire, a sprawling network of clubs, logistics companies, and less savory enterprises, was built on a foundation of brutal logic. Every person had a price, every action had a motive, and every loyalty had an expiration date. He had learned that lesson the hard way, etched into his memory by the betrayal of the one person he had allowed himself to love, a woman who had sold his secrets for a pittance and a new life. Since then, his world had been one of transactions. Nothing was given for free. His new maid, Lena, did not make sense. She was 20 years old, an American, and worked with a quiet efficiency that bordered on monastic. She never asked for advances, never complained, never engaged in the petty gossip the other staff members whispered in the kitchens. She simply did her work, did it better than anyone before her, and disappeared into the city at the end of her shift. She was a placid surface, and Min-jun knew that the most placid surfaces often concealed the most dangerous depths. His suspicion had started as a flicker, a minor anomaly. Twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, she stayed 2 hours late, refusing overtime pay. She would meticulously clean the secondary kitchen, the one rarely used, and pack away the leftover food. The head cook, Mrs. On, was complicit, turning a blind eye and even adding fresh portions to the containers. Then, Lena would leave with her canvas bag, noticeably weighted down. Where did she go? He'd had his head of security, Park, run a background check. It had come back clean. Lena Jones. No criminal record.
No outstanding debts.
No family in Seoul. She lived in a small, cheap apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the other side of the river. She sent a small portion of her salary back to an account in America, registered to an elderly woman, likely her grandmother. The rest she seemed to live on. There was no secret boyfriend funneling her money, no drug habit, no gambling addiction. She was, on paper, exactly what she appeared to be, a young woman working a menial job far from home. It was the lack of a vulnerability that made him uneasy. Everyone had a weakness, a lever that could be used to move them. Lena appeared to have none. Tonight, his unease had solidified into a cold knot of certainty. He would find her lever. He would understand her. He stood at the window long after she left, watching the taillights of the city bleed into a red river below. He despised puzzles he could not solve. He gave her a 20-minute head start before descending to the private garage. He bypassed his own armored sedan and chose a nondescript black Hyundai, one of the many anonymous vehicles kept for surveillance. He drove himself, melting into the chaotic flow of Seoul's nighttime traffic. Park had offered to tail her, but Min-jun had refused. This was a personal curiosity, an itch he needed to scratch himself. If she was a threat, he wanted to see it with his own eyes. If she was a spy for one of his rivals, he wanted to look upon her face when her mask slipped. Finding her was easy. He'd had a tracker, no larger than a grain of rice, affixed to the strap of her tote bag a week ago. The signal led him away from the gleaming towers of Gangnam, across the Han River, and into a labyrinth of narrow streets and older buildings. The neighborhood was a world away from his penthouse. Here, the air smelled of grilled mackerel and damp concrete, and the neon signs were faded and flickering. The signal stopped outside a small, unassuming diner. The sign above the door read Sam and Roses, the English letters painted in a cheerful but peeling red. It looked like a relic from another era, sandwiched between a laundromat and a shuttered electronics shop. Min-jun parked across the street in the shadows, killing the engine. He watched. Through the large front window, he saw her. She had shed her coat, and her hair was tied back with a simple scarf. She was wearing a flour-dusted apron over her clothes. But she was not eating. She was working. She moved with purpose between the few occupied tables and the kitchen pass-through, a coffee pot in one hand. An elderly man, stooped with age, worked the grill, while a tiny, silver-haired woman wiped down the counter. Min-jun watched for nearly an hour, his mind struggling to process the scene. This was not a clandestine meeting with a rival. This was not a drug deal. This was a diner. He saw Lena take an order from a table of factory workers, her Korean fluent and gentle. He saw her share a quiet laugh with the old woman, Rose, her face illuminated by a warmth he had never seen in the sterile halls of his home. She refilled coffee cups, cleared plates, and moved with an easy grace that spoke of long practice. There was no transaction here. The elderly couple treated her like a cherished relative, and she treated them with a patient, tender care. He felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation stir in his chest. It was not anger, not suspicion. It was a profound and unsettling confusion. Why would she do this? Work a full day cleaning his home, then come here to work for free in a failing diner? It was illogical. It served no purpose. It was an act of kindness. The word felt foreign on his tongue, a concept from a language he no longer spoke. He watched her place a comforting hand on the old man's shoulder as he leaned against the grill, exhausted. The gesture was small, simple, and it struck Kwon Min-jun with the force of a physical blow. It was the first piece of the puzzle, and it made the picture more inscrutable than ever. 2 nights later, on a Friday, he followed her again. The tracker in her bag led him to a different part of the same neighborhood, a place the city's gloss had not yet reached. He parked the Hyundai at the end of a poorly lit alleyway, the air thick with the smell of refuse and rain-soaked cardboard. His hand rested instinctively on the cool metal of the pistol tucked into the waistband of his trousers. This was a place where violence was a common currency. If she was meeting someone here, it was not for coffee. He got out of the car, his expensive shoes silent on the broken pavement. He kept to the deepest shadows, his body a fluid extension of the darkness. He moved with the predatory grace that had kept him alive for years, his senses on high alert. He heard voices ahead, low murmurs, a cough, the scuff of a shoe. He rounded a corner, pressing himself flat against a brick wall, and peered around the edge. What he saw stopped him cold. Lena was there, her back to him. She stood in the center of a small, cleared space, her canvas tote bag open at her feet. Gathered in a loose semicircle around her were half a dozen men and women, their faces lined with hardship, their clothes ragged. The city's forgotten people, the homeless. And Lena was feeding them. She was handing out the foil-wrapped containers from his own kitchen, the beef bulgogi, the rice, the kimchi. She spoke to each of them, her voice soft but clear. She asked a man with a haunted look in his eyes if his cough was any better. She handed a pair of thick, clean socks to a woman whose feet were wrapped in plastic bags. She moved among them without fear, without judgment. There was a quiet dignity in her actions, a sense of profound respect for the people she was helping. They were not a project to her, they were human beings. One of the men, larger than the others and smelling of cheap liquor, became agitated, demanding a second container. He stepped toward her, his voice rising, his posture aggressive.
Minun's muscles tensed.
His hand tightened on his weapon. He was ready to move, to eliminate the threat with the surgical precision he was known for. It would be simple, silent. But Lena did not flinch. She did not back away. She stood her ground and looked the man directly in the eye. "Brother," she said, her voice calm and firm, "there is enough for everyone to have one.
Mrs. Song hasn't eaten yet.
We must make sure she gets hers." She gestured toward a frail, elderly woman huddled at the back of the group. The man's aggression seemed to deflate, replaced by a flicker of shame. He mumbled an apology and stepped back, allowing Lena to pass. She went to the elderly woman, knelt down, and placed the container gently in her trembling hands, her fingers briefly covering the woman's in a gesture of simple, human connection. Min-jun remained frozen in the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs for a reason he couldn't name. He had witnessed countless acts of brutality, of calculated cruelty. He had orchestrated them himself. But this quiet, defiant act of grace in a forgotten alley, was more powerful than any display of force he had ever seen. It was a strength he did not understand. He thought of the woman he had failed to protect, years ago. She had possessed a similar light, a belief in the inherent goodness of people that he had dismissed as naive. Her naivete had gotten her killed, a casualty of his world. He had promised himself then that he would never again mistake kindness for weakness, but he had also vowed to never let it near him again. And here it was, in his home, in his city, in the form of his maid. He felt a sudden, sharp impulse to step out of the shadows, to pull her away from this place, to lock her away in the sterile safety of his penthouse where the ugliness of the world could not touch her. The thought was possessive, irrational, and it shook him to his core. He was losing control of the situation, and worse, of himself. As he watched her finish her work and pack her empty bag, he knew this was no longer a simple matter of suspicion. Lena Jones was not a threat to his empire. She was a threat to his entire world. The following week was a study in controlled tension. In the penthouse, nothing had changed. Lena still polished the floors, her movements a silent ballet of efficiency. Minjun still sat at his desk, the silence between them thick with unspoken things. But now, when he watched her, it was with a different kind of intensity. He was no longer looking for a lie. He was trying to understand a truth that defied his experience. He found himself noticing the smallest details, the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she repaired a loose thread on a curtain, the faint scent of lavender and soap that clung to her, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of the apartment. He caught himself tracking her movements on the security monitors, an obsession he couldn't seem to quell. He followed her again that Tuesday. This time, her path led to a large, state-run building with a faded sign identifying it as a senior care facility. He watched from the car as she entered, her tote bag now filled with sacks of groceries, fresh vegetables, bags of rice, packages of meat. She did not emerge for over 3 hours. Minjun's curiosity overrode his caution. Using a set of master keys his organization had acquired for just such purposes, he let himself in through a service entrance, moving through the quiet, antiseptic-smelling halls like a phantom. He found her in the main common room. The air was filled with the soft murmur of television and the scent of brewing barley tea. Lena was not cleaning or serving. She was sitting on a low stool, a book open in her lap, reading aloud to a small group of elderly residents. Her voice was a soothing melody, her Korean unaccented and clear. She was reading an old folk tale, her expression animated as she described the antics of a mischievous tiger. The old men and women gathered around her were captivated, their faces, etched with the maps of long lives, softened with quiet joy. After she finished the story, she did not leave. She stayed and talked with them, listening to their stories with a patient attention that was clearly genuine. She helped one gentleman with a crossword puzzle, her head bent close to his. She complimented a woman on her knitting, her fingers gently tracing the pattern of the half-finished sweater. She was not an employee here. She was a friend, a visitor, a small, steady light in the dim twilight of their lives. As Minjun watched from the doorway of an empty room down the hall, a familiar ache tightened in his chest. It was the ghost of a wound he thought had long since scarred over. He remembered evenings spent with his mentor, the old man who had taken him in after his parents died. His mentor's wife had been like this, full of a quiet, unshakable grace. She would read to him, listen to his childish fears, and make him believe, for a little while, that the world was not the cold, predatory place he knew it to be. She was the only mother he had ever known, and she had been caught in the crossfire of a rival's ambition, a casualty of a war that was his, not hers. He had held her as her life bled out onto the pristine floors of their home, her last breath a whispered plea for him to not let the darkness consume him. He had failed her. He had let the darkness become his armor, his weapon, his identity. Seeing Lena now, embodying that same selfless spirit, felt like a judgment, a reminder of the man he might have been. He backed away into the shadows, his retreat as silent as his arrival. He returned to his car, the sterile leather and cold metal a familiar comfort. But the comfort was gone. The image of Lena's gentle smile was burned into his mind. He had set out to uncover a conspiracy, a betrayal. Instead, he had uncovered a secret life of radical, inexplicable goodness. And it terrified him more than any rival's threat, because he did not know how to fight it. He did not know how to control it, and he was beginning to suspect, with a dread that was almost panic, that he did not want to. The shift happened subtly. Minjun began leaving things for her. A more ergonomic kneeling pad appeared in the supply closet. The cheap, harsh cleaning chemicals were replaced with expensive, organic brands that were easier on the skin. A small, high-quality space heater materialized in the drafty corner of the kitchen where she ate her lunch. He never acknowledged these changes. Lena never mentioned them. But a new kind of silence began to grow between them, one that was not empty, but filled with a fragile, unspoken awareness. His obsession did not go unnoticed. His second-in-command, a sharp-eyed man named Choi, saw the way Minjun's gaze lingered on the maid. Choi, a man whose ambition was as sharp and cold as a knife, saw it as a weakness, a distraction. "The wolves are getting bold," Choi said one evening, standing before Minjun's desk. "They're pushing into the markets in Yongsan, squeezing our vendors." Minjun's eyes were on a security monitor, where Lena could be seen carefully dusting a vase. "We will handle it. They're rabid dogs," Choi pressed. "They need to be put down, not just disciplined. A show of force is required." "Your focus seems divided." The insinuation was clear, hanging in the air like cigar smoke. Minjun's gaze snapped from the monitor to Choi, his eyes suddenly glacial. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Is my focus your concern, Choi?" "Your focus is the organization's foundation, boss," Choi replied, his voice smooth, but his posture rigid. "Then allow me to be clear. The wolves are a nuisance. Handle them. But know that my focus is precisely where it needs to be. On all my assets." He let the last word hang in the air, a deliberate ambiguity. He knew Choi would interpret it as a warning. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that Choi would now be watching Lena, too, looking for a way to use her. The danger was no longer just from the outside, it was in the room with him. The first move was not against Lena, but against her world. The wolves, led by a brutish thug named Kong, decided to expand their protection racket. Their target was the small, vulnerable diner owned by Sam and Rose. Lena was there that night, wiping down tables after the dinner rush, when the two men from the wolves entered. They were physically imposing, dressed in cheap, flashy suits, their faces set in masks of casual menace. The air crackled with their presence. Rose's hand flew to her mouth, and old Sam, looking frail behind the counter, gripped the handle of a spatula like a weapon. "Evening, Grandma," the leader sneered, his eyes roaming the small, clean space with contempt. "Nice little place you got here. Be a shame if something happened to it. A fire, maybe, or a health code violation." Lena stepped forward, placing herself between the thugs and the elderly couple. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her voice was steady. "They have nothing for you. You should leave." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And who are you?" "The help." He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the soft curves of her body. "Maybe you're the payment." A cold fury, sharp and pure, cut through Lena's fear. She thought of Mr. Kwan, of the absolute, lethal stillness he projected. She tried to channel a fraction of it. "I work for a man who does not like his interests disturbed. His name is Kwon Min-jun. I suggest you walk out that door before he hears you've been bothering his friends." She had no right to use his name. She knew it was a catastrophic gamble, a line she should never cross. But in that moment, seeing the terror in Rose's eyes, it was the only weapon she had. The name landed like a stone in a quiet pond. The thug's sneer faltered. Kwon Min-jun's reputation was a living thing in the Seoul underworld. He was not a man to be trifled with. But the man's surprise quickly curdled into suspicion. "Kwon Min-jun," he scoffed, though with less conviction. "What would he want with a dump like this?" "You're lying." He took a step closer, his hand reaching for her. And then, the diner door opened. The bell above it gave a cheerful, incongruous jingle. Kwon Min-jun stood in the doorway. He was not wearing a suit, but dark trousers and a black cashmere turtleneck that made him seem like a creature carved from the night itself. He did not look at the thugs. He did not look at Lena. His gaze was fixed on the terrified face of Rose. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" he asked, his voice a quiet, deadly calm that was more terrifying than any shout. The two men from the wolves froze, their faces paling. They recognized him instantly. The one who had threatened Lena looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Minjun's eyes finally slid to the thugs, and his expression was utterly devoid of emotion. It was the detached look of a man contemplating the removal of an inconvenience. "You have 2 seconds to explain why you are in my presence," he said softly. The men practically fell over themselves, stammering apologies as they backed away and fled into the night. Minjun didn't watch them go. He walked calmly to the counter, his presence filling the small diner, sucking all the air out of it. He looked at Lena, and for the first time, his mask of cold control was gone. In his eyes, she saw a maelstrom of fury, concern, and something else she couldn't name, something fiercely possessive. "You used my name," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the very floorboards. Lena's borrowed courage evaporated. She stood before him, feeling small and exposed. They were threatening them. "I didn't know what else to do." "You have no idea what you have done," he bit out, the words sharp and precise. He took a step closer, crowding her against the counter. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, bergamot and cedar. "You painted a target on this place. On them. On yourself." Tears pricked her eyes, tears of fear and frustration. "They're good people. They didn't deserve this." "Deserve has nothing to do with it," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He raised a hand, and for a terrifying second, she thought he might strike her. Instead, his thumb brushed against her cheek, a touch so unexpectedly gentle it stole her breath. His gaze was intense, searching. "You are a complication I cannot afford. And you are a complication I will not allow to be harmed." That was his confession. Not of love, but of something far more dangerous. It was an admission of ownership. A claim. In that moment, the line between employer and employee, between his world and hers, was irrevocably erased. She had dragged his darkness into her light, and now his darkness would not let her go. The aftermath was a blur of calculated action. Minjun spoke to Sam and Rose, his voice now gentle, reassuring. He introduced himself as a business associate of Lena's who handled security. He was so convincing, so calm, that the elderly couple, still shaken, accepted his explanation. It was Lena who cemented the lie, her heart aching with the deceit. She told them Mr. Kwan ran a private security firm and that she'd called him as a precaution. She saw the relief in their eyes and felt like the worst kind of traitor. She had protected them by enmeshing them in the web of a man whose business was violence. It was her first truly gray act, and the guilt settled in her stomach like a cold stone.
Minhyun drove her home.
The ride was silent, the air in the luxury car thick with tension. He didn't take her to her small apartment. He took her back to the penthouse. "You'll stay here for now," he said as they ascended in the private elevator. It wasn't a request. "The men from tonight will report back to their leader, Kong. He will see your name as an insult. He will see you as a way to get to me." "I can't just leave my life," she protested, her voice weak. "Your life changed the moment you spoke my name," he countered, his gaze unwavering as the elevator doors slid open. "This is your life now." He led her not to a staff room, but to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment, with its own balcony overlooking the river. "Park will retrieve your things tomorrow. You will not leave this building without me." The days that followed were a strange sort of prison. Lena was no longer a maid. The other staff treated her with a new, fearful deference. She was now Mr. Kwan's something. No one knew what to call it. She was a guest, a ward, a possession. She ate her meals with him in a silence that was no longer just aware, but charged with a palpable, electric current. He watched her, his dark eyes missing nothing. He learned the way she liked her tea, the books she read, the soft hum she made when she was lost in thought. And she learned him. She saw the exhaustion behind his eyes late at night, the tension in his shoulders as he took calls in his study, the single, faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. One evening, he found her on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. "You do not belong in this world, Lena," he said, his voice quiet as he came to stand beside her. "I didn't ask to be in it," she replied, not looking at him. "I was just trying to help some people." "Why?" he asked, the question abrupt, raw. "The diner. The homeless. The elders. Why do you do it? What do you gain?" She finally turned to face him, her expression earnest. "Gain? It's not about gaining anything. It's just what you do. When you see someone who needs help and you have the ability to give it, you just do it. It's not a transaction." He stared at her, his face a mask of cold confusion. "Everything is a transaction," he insisted, the words a creed he had lived by for years. "No," she said softly, shaking her head. "It's not." That was when he knew she was the most dangerous person he had ever met. She operated on a set of principles that were entirely alien to him, a moral compass that pointed to a true north he couldn't see. She was not naive. She had stood down thugs in a dark alley. She was not weak. She had used his name as a weapon. She was strong, but her strength came from a source he couldn't comprehend. And he found himself wanting to understand it, wanting to protect it, wanting, desperately, to keep it for himself. The retaliation came, as he knew it would. But Kong of the Wolves was not stupid enough to mount a direct assault on Minjun's fortress. He was a scavenger, a predator who targeted the weak. He went back to the source. He went for the diner. The call came from a frantic Rose, her voice choked with sobs. Minjun put her on speakerphone in his study, Lena standing beside him, her hands clenched into fists. Kong and his men were there. They had smashed the front window. They were holding Sam, a knife to his throat. And they wanted the girl. They wanted Lena. They told him to bring her to the diner in 1 hour. Alone. "It's a trap," Minjun said, his voice lethally calm as he ended the call. "He knows I won't bring you. He wants to draw me out." "You can't go," Lena pleaded, grabbing his arm. "He'll kill you. And he'll kill them." "He will kill them anyway," Minjun stated, his face grim. "He cannot leave witnesses." "That is the price of your kindness." The word was a lash, directed as much at himself as at her. Lena's mind raced. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but under it, something else was taking shape. Resolve. She knew this neighborhood. She knew its rhythms, its secrets. She knew the back alleys, the service tunnels that ran behind the shops, the fire escape that led to the roof of the laundromat next door. "There's another way in," she said, her voice urgent. "Behind the diner. The storage room door is old. The lock is rusted. A good kick would take it down. It opens into the alley that runs behind the whole block." She looked at him, her eyes wide and clear. "They'll be watching the front. They won't expect anyone to come from behind." He stared at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He saw not a frightened victim, but a strategist. She was not just the heart of the operation. She was offering him the tactical advantage. She was taking action. "Park is already mobilizing a team," he said. "They will be in position in 20 minutes. "It's not enough," she insisted. "Kong is unpredictable. He might not wait. You need to get in there now. Distract them. Get Sam away from him." She was right. It was a risk, but it was the best one they had. He looked at her, at the fierce determination on her face. She was not asking to be rescued. She was helping to plan the assault. She was in this with him. He gave a curt nod. "Stay here. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." He turned to leave, but her hand on his arm stopped him. "Be careful, Minjun," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. The sound of it on her lips was a shock, a moment of profound intimacy in the face of imminent violence. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face.
He didn't say anything.
He simply covered her hand with his own for a brief second, a silent acknowledgement, a promise. Then he was gone. Lena did not just wait. Pacing the vast penthouse, she felt a terrifying sense of helplessness. Minjun had gone into the fire for her, for the consequences of her actions. She had given him the key, but he was the one walking through the door. She went to the security console, her fingers flying over the keypad, bringing up the city's public traffic cameras. She found the intersection nearest the diner, her heart pounding as she zoomed in, watching the street for any sign of his car, of Park's team, of the violence she knew was about to erupt. She was no longer just a maid. She was a willing participant, a lookout in a war she had never wanted to join. She watched the screen, her breath held, and prayed. The climax was brutal and swift. Min-jun entered the diner alone through the back, exactly as Lena had described. The chaos he unleashed was a thing of terrible, precise beauty. He moved not like a brawler, but like a surgeon, his actions economical and deadly. The fight was over in less than a minute. By the time Park's team stormed the front, all that was left was to clean up the mess. Kong and his men were incapacitated, their threat permanently neutralized. Sam was safe, shaken but unharmed. Min-jun returned to the penthouse near dawn, the first gray light of morning spilling through the windows. He had a shallow cut on his cheekbone, and his black turtleneck was torn at the shoulder, but he was otherwise untouched. He found Lena asleep in the chair in his study, the security feeds still active on the monitor in front of her. He stood over her for a long moment, watching the soft rise and fall of her chest.
She had done this.
She had brought chaos and light into his meticulously ordered world of shadows. She had shown him a strength he had forgotten existed and forced him to confront the ghost of the man he used to be. She was a liability, a weakness, a target, and she was the most valuable thing in his life. Her eyes fluttered open as if she sensed his presence. She sat up, her gaze immediately finding the cut on his face. She started to rise, to move toward him, but he held up a hand to stop her. "It is done," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Sam and Rose are safe. I've arranged for them to take a long, well-funded vacation. When they return, they will find their diner has been purchased by a holding company I own. They will be paid a generous salary to manage it for the rest of their days. They will be protected." Lena sank back into the chair, relief washing over her. But she knew a cost had been paid. The simple, pure relationship she'd had with them was gone, replaced by a gilded cage built by his money and his power. Nothing would ever be the same. "You are not safe here," he continued, his voice flat. "As long as you are with me, someone will always see you as a lever. I can send you away, back to America, give you enough money to live 10 lifetimes. You would never have to see this world again." He was offering her an escape, a clean break, a return to the life she had known. She looked at him, at this cold, dangerous man who had just dismantled a rival crew to save an old couple he didn't know, all because of her. She thought of his silent acts of kindness, the knee pad, the expensive soap, the heater. She thought of the raw vulnerability in his eyes when he'd asked her why. She knew that leaving would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing to do. But as she looked at him, standing there in the dawn light, a warrior returning from a battle fought on her behalf, she realized the truth. Her old world was gone. Her quiet, invisible life had ended the moment he had first followed her into the night. Her new life was here, in this silent penthouse, beside this complicated, lethal man. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She stood up and walked toward him until she was standing directly in front of him. She reached up, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw, stopping just short of the cut on his cheek. "My place is here now." It was not a surrender.
It was a choice.
A conscious decision to step out of the light and into his shadows, to stand with him, not behind him. Min-jun's expression did not change, but she saw something shift deep in his dark eyes. It was a surrender of his own. The final wall around his heart, the one he had built of ice and steel after a lifetime of betrayal, finally crumbled. He did not say, "I love you." He did not make promises he couldn't keep. He simply leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of profound, aching finality. The silence that filled the room was not empty. It was absolute. It was the sound of two solitary worlds colliding and forging a new one, a dangerous and uncertain territory they would now navigate together.